Hey everyone, and welcome. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for solving cross team accessibility challenges with Cypress. Accessibility is one of those areas where the work doesn't really sit neatly with a single team. It spans engineering, QA, product, marketing, and sometimes even legal. And because of that, the workflows supporting those initiatives can get messy fast. Today, we are going to dig into how accessibility work plays out across teams in the real world and how you can structure your workflows so that responsibility is shared without slowing anyone down. All right. Now, before we dive in, I have just a couple of quick notes to make this session run smoothly. And starting off, if you have a question at any point, drop that into the Q&A panel. You don't have to wait till the end. Stack them up as they come through. We will reserve some time at the end of the session for answering those questions live. We'll also be answering some of the pre submitted questions throughout the session as Mark is going through his presentation. Finally, this session is being recorded, so if you need to step away or you want to revisit anything later on, you'll be able to. All right, with that, I am really excited to bring on today's presenter, Mark Noonan. Mark has spent a lot of time working directly with teams as they scale accessibility practices, not just at the code level, but across organizations where multiple teams need to collaborate without stepping on each other. So, Mark, welcome to the stage. Why don't you come on up and join me?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here for the webinar. Hope everybody's doing well. So we're going to get started, and I'll share my screen in a second, and just also set up. I will run this a little bit different to some of the other webinars you might have been in the past, where to me, one of the things I'm always looking for is how to make it not just reading slides, which is sometimes necessary, of course, but also something that can get a little dry. So we got a ton of questions before this one, all around the topic of accessibility and how teams work together. And we structured the middle part of this kind of around those questions that Jenna will be able to come on and surface some of those ones that came before the event. And I'll just kind of talk through some scenarios. And I have a lot of example stuff in front of me that I can pull up as reference points for some of the things we're talking about. But hopefully making this a little bit more conversational, a little bit more just like an informal session that you might have just working with somebody is the goal here. So I'm going to switch over to screen sharing because we will begin just by setting some context and making sure everybody's caught up. I took a look at the questions and the kinds of registrants we have, and I see a huge mix. So once I get screen sharing here, we'll continue. There we go. So here's, first of all, my assumptions about you. If you're at this webinar, you're either part of an organization that builds accessible software, or you are part of an organization that wants to build accessible software, or just has the obligation to do so. So I'm going to assume that you know a little bit about accessibility at a topic, or you wouldn't have come to this type of event anyway. And also that you have a bit of background in Cypress and test automation. Not too much. I don't think everybody coming in here needs to know a lot, but just enough that you know the general idea of what Cypress is for sure. And like I said, I kind of want you to think of this as if we started to work together and you're a new team member and you're at a place that uses Cypress accessibility and you have a bunch of questions. Often when you think about accessibility automation, the first things that come to mind are like, okay, we can't do it because of X, we can't do it because of Y, it's going to be really hard. There's these sets of things that are there. And so all of those initial things that are kind of painful about running automation, that's something that we will talk about some of those and hopefully show you how Cypress accessibility specifically can help you with some of those things. But also, even if that's not for you as a product, just the experience and the way of thinking about accessibility programs hopefully has some benefit anyway. So first, we'll start with what's hard about getting consistent accessibility outcomes across teams. And when I mention this, I'm thinking about like okay, multiple teams of developers is one aspect, but then also handoffs between designers. How do product people talk about accessibility? How do we surface things to leadership? These are all issues that have come up that have, got answers, and different things apply to different teams. We'll look a little bit at how Cypress accessibility itself as a product can alleviate those, just like how it works. What are we talking about when we talk about that? And then we'll get into questions and examples. At the end, then, Jenna will have any kind of live questions that have come in that we need to answer before we wrap up, and we'll just talk about takeaways. And this is our agenda. So first of all, very quick, this is my only slide going through like why accessibility is important. To me, it is about the independence of your users. This is a set of questions they have to always know the answer to if you're using the application that you build. Doesn't matter if they use different accessible like technology, different assistive technology to use their computers. They're using keyboards, if they can see the interface or not. They need to know, where are they in the app? What's on the page in front of them? What's the current state of everything? Are forms filled in? Do they have errors, right? What's possible to do? Yeah, and that last one, what are the actions I can take? And most accessibility work at the end of the day boils down to making sure the availability of these 4 questions is the same, whether you have a disability or not. And the implementation of that involves lots of rules and guidelines and everything to help offer a way in which you can determine if you're doing well or not with accessibility, like if it's likely to be usable. But the spirit of it is you want someone to be able to use your application without having to ask someone else for help, without having to get blocked or do something that's longer or slower or harder work than somebody who doesn't have a disability. So those are the conditions that I think of for accessibility, and that's something that underpins all of this. Even though there is a compliance aspect and everything else, I think the spirit of having something more focused on the user helps you make the right decisions and decide what to do to actually move the needle. So there are a lot of things that we could consider to be hard about accessibility automation. Often if you Google how to do it, you'll find very small examples of running a single accessibility assertion in a test or doing some other things like that. And there is a range of things you can do with in-test accessibility automation, where people who are writing tests know pretty much what they're doing, that they're going to add certain checks here and there, and it will kind of become a part of your test pipeline. At a certain scale or just level of knowledge of the team, that becomes difficult. And there's a range of technical challenges, which I put here. We'll just kind of bubble them in and surface what they are. We don't need to take them all one by one, but like how do you look at the history and the introduction of issues? How do you do separate blocking with accessibility issues differently to how you do functional testing? What are the handoffs like when you have a problem? If you're getting a text output that says, here's the issues you had, and you don't have like the DOM from that failure, how do you deal with those things? What happens when you have conflicts in CI, when there's increasing CI execution time because you've added lots of accessibility tests, but then they may themselves introduce frustration related to flake and to timing issues and people having to wait longer and failure rates increasing and things like that. Then how do you get all the teams to do things? And lastly, how do you handle results with agents? This has become another one. And so these are the technical, like the world of issues that are just overhead, wherein in order to address accessibility issues, you must have some means of dealing with this sort of set of overhead, set of structures that you need and getting the program up and running. But at the same time, not a lot of these things directly make anything better for your users. It's just stuff you have to try to cut through in order to be able to find the issues and smoothly do the work to get there. And these are a big part of it, but there's another part of it that I don't have a slide for, which is like, what are the emotional challenges? What's the resistance among teams just in general to having to work on this, or like the attitude towards accessibility? The feeling sometimes that it requires a lot of specialized knowledge and details that are irrelevant from other aspects of software quality. So I do challenge that as well, and I would like to think of accessibility as a core quality metric. It is a part of shipping a working product to your users. And so if you think of 10%, 20% of people that might use your product having a disability, you don't want to send a broken experience to them. You don't want to spend the entire effort of your company to send the wrong HTML at the last mile of like your otherwise pristine, excellent product, just sending something that doesn't work for people. When we think about how Cypress accessibility is different to the things that you might have tried for automation before, I just put up some of the UI here for anybody who's not familiar with it, but it's basically a collection of reports and tooling and everything implemented in a way that's kind of a side effect of your mainline testing. People aren't often writing tests specifically to get results out of Cypress accessibility. If you have Cypress tests that are moving through your application, Cypress accessibility is seeing everything that happens, but doing so in a way that's offloaded into Cypress Cloud based on the artifact. So to back up for a second, if you're newer to Cypress itself, it is a test runner that you can use in an open source way that allows you to write your tests, record, run normal end-to-end tests and component tests. And then as people scale up that activity, there is a Cypress Cloud SaaS service that lets you do kind of management of your runs, make them work in a more efficient way, have analytics across your tests and stuff like that. So there's a bunch of things here that are related to core test management principles. And then Cypress accessibility just piggybacks on all of that work where you already wrote tests that might do 1,000 things, open and close all your menus, go into all your forms, all that sort of stuff. And we can process that information that you're uploading to Cypress Cloud in a way that your tests have no idea about. So Cypress accessibility is derived from the metadata from Cypress Cloud runs, and that lets us break it all down into pages. We can do thousands of accessibility checks and merge all that information. No one has to know how to do it. So without going into all those details, because we're going to see it in and out in the demo here as well, and kind of talk about it, how we're using it to answer some questions. But for the pain points that I had identified before, it means all teams can do the same type of testing because it's just going to be done. You don't have to ask anyone to install some code, write tests differently, slow down their pipeline. When you turn it on for your organization, it's on every run, it's on every build of your application that has Cypress tests recorded. And so no one has to set it up or do anything. They also can't do it wrong, right? You're not going to test wrong in a way that breaks Cypress accessibility. And so all these things are somewhat mitigated and somewhat made easier, right? I'm not saying we completely solve every problem, but we do offer a lot of things that reduce the overhead here, so you can focus a little bit more on handling the results and doing the impact. So this is intended to be surfacing some of these areas of difference. If you have deeper questions on these, we can also do that at the end, or we can do that like in separate follow-ups. So within this Goldcast platform, we have the ability to have a poll as well, and I am curious for the people who attend something like this, just understanding, like, what about your accessibility process do you wish was better? I picked a few things in here, but I'm always really interested in what do you think should be better? What could you do faster? What would you like to start doing? What would you like to stop doing? My main way of like doing product discovery here is to work in the onboarding process with new customers, also in the trial process if this is something you're considering, and then working sessions every now and then. I know that some of you on the call currently have access, like our current customers, so just know we can do meetings pretty much at the time that you would like. We've got some people we hear from a lot, some people we don't hear from as much. But I would rather fill up my calendar with like meaningful working sessions, helping somebody do what they need to for accessibility and learn about the product needs and the improvements that we can make in the future through those working sessions where you actually got something out of it. I would way rather do that than have an open-ended discovery call where we try and, speculate about what might be useful and show you some new features. So I find those incredibly productive. And so knowing what you would do if you had a magic wand, what you would change is fantastic for us. And I would encourage you to pop an answer into this when you get a chance. So now we're going to get questions. Oh yeah, Jenna is going to start to be a part of this, and we'll go to the questions there.
Yeah, absolutely. So as people are filling out that poll, I thought we could start with one of the questions that came in ahead of time. So I'm going to go ahead and pop that up onto the screen. So, can this be treated as a separate stream of work to parallelize the testing process? What are your thoughts on that, Mark?
This is one I was very happy to see come in as I was scrolling through them, because it's the exact idea for how this works anyway. So I thought we'd start with it early. You can probably tell from how I described it that the premise of Cypress accessibility is it will execute as your run is coming in with its data. So we totally isolate the functional correctness tests, maybe your regression suite that's doing some health checks and making sure things are working. We take that and we separate that from the truth about the accessibility. Even though for a lot of people, it is the correct outcome to say, I want to fail my whole pipeline for any accessibility issue, we take it very seriously, and that's still something you can do with Cypress accessibility, but it's an opt-in process. And the reason for being parallel is, first of all, you can't necessarily run 10,000 AX core checks on your standard Cypress run and gather everything together if you are doing it in your tests, because it's just so much more time consuming than your other assertions and your other steps where we inject the library, we do all these things to get the accessibility data. So it would be extremely time consuming to add this into the tests. But also, in order to find the truth about the accessibility of your application, we really want all your tests to complete their steps. So a fully green run that was not blocked by accessibility checks gets all of the data about the accessibility of every step of all those workflows. And that's really important to the accuracy of the results and the consistency over time, where if you have failures and you don't see parts of your application, you can't answer that question on that run. So minimizing disruption to functional testing is good there. And it's also good for the careful introduction of a new system that will not block developers needlessly. So we hadn't discussed exactly how to move on between these questions. I think I don't need to bring up anything on the screen, Jenna, and we could move on to the next one whenever you're ready.
Sure. Let's go ahead and I will bring our next pre-submitted question on. And I think it kind of ties it directly into some of the things that you were just saying in your previous answer about Cypress accessibility compared to other options that are available. So can you dive a little deeper into that? How is Cypress accessibility different than other automated scans?
So the premise of Cypress accessibility is still based on Axe Core, fundamentally, which people are probably already used to. But I'll share my screen now and show a little bit of how it works and what's different about it. So we have a couple of pieces of the puzzle here. Let me bring this up. I have to find all of you again. Okay. So we should be sharing this window here where we see everything that we need to, yeah. So this is an example of a Cypress accessibility report. I'm going to move over to something else in here as well. This has more findings in it as a starting point. So when this report is generated through using the Axe Core library, we're able to see like a list of pages and everything like that. So the parallelizable part of it that we already talked about is one thing. And then there is the a set of things that go with it, like how we treat ignoring elements is different to how a lot of libraries would do that. You can always recall an element that's been ignored. And there's also some custom rules that we have that we can use to detect kind of bad patterns with implementing your elements. So if you have divs that are used as buttons and they're not semantically correct, Cypress can add to the Axe Core information where those types of issues might not be there. We can say there's suspicious interactions on certain elements that represent, something that's been implemented in a custom way that's not that useful. So we can cover a lot of different pages. We can produce a report like this where there's 100 pages. This is kind of a crawling report that we have a test for. And then we can also do things like compare the branches. So we can take a run like this and come in and see between these two runs, like what happened with accessibility to go from 99 to 100 or something like that. So I'll take this one as an example here. So there's a collection of things. If we wanted to go in, and actually maybe we'll come in more through the front door on this one here. We'll take a look at 100% run and a run that was, requiring some changes. So we can come in here and we can see the diff and be able to explain like what rules got better, what happened, what got better, got worse. There's all of those things that are different as well. And then where we see something else where I know there is ignored elements lurking in this report, we can come in and see that if we did ignore stuff, it's still available here. And the significance of that is it's not always clear when you have done something in a lot of other products that allow you to configure and support accessibility issues in different ways. It's not always clear what was not in the surface area of the report, where you may have like a really good score, but you have something that is including or excluding a lot more than you might think. So we capture all the ignored stuff for reviews as well. It allows you to be super aggressive in some of the topics we'll talk about with the ability to fine-tune things for different teams and for different pull request scenarios and stuff like that, because you never have any mystery about what was not included in the elements you ignored. So a few different aspects of what's different in there, and yeah, that hopefully answers that question for that person, in addition to what we talked about at the top.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Going on to another topic here. I'm going to share this question. I would like to dive into how to repeatedly test accessibility so that there's no need to do adjustments every time that you want to run an accessibility check. So what does the process look like?
So there is a couple of aspects to a question like this. One is if you are writing tests just for functional reasons, and we're doing something like Cypress accessibility where it layers on top of those, you don't have to do the kind of maintenance you might have to do if you have a different accessibility testing suite. So definitely are some situations where people will have accessibility checks that rely on an entirely independent workflow. And so you might have your functional tests passing that are in Cypress, and then you go to this other place that you have accessibility tests there. And when your functional tests are updated in order to match your new application behavior, or UI has changed or something like that, your accessibility tests are off to the side and they have to be maintained separately. So one thing with Cypress accessibility is as long as your tests are working, there's no extra accessibility checks that you're having to adjust for run by run. It'll produce the output in a consistent way and give you the feedback based on your functional tests passing. There's an additional layer to talk about too, which is, I'll show the example here of using Cyprompt, which is another way of creating a test in Cypress if you're not familiar with this. And this allows you to write tests using natural language, and that in and of itself can become a good repeatable accessibility test that's a little bit more resilient to application changes. So I'll bring up one here. And part of why I'm showing this is that one of the things that people come to Cypress accessibility for, and apologies, I'm once again finding everybody's window. One of the things people come for is the ability to, where are you? There we go. Yep. So the ability to deal with like complex situations, you can see in the middle here, I have some tests for this application. We're just looking at my cursor window, and there's a bunch of variations. So actually this one is going through multiple languages. It's going through 2 languages and 3 different themes of a to-do app that I made using Capacitor. So this is just a basic to-do app variation, but I decided to overdo it, make it in English and French, give us some themes to change around to represent this type of reusability scenario. So we have a test that can move its way through these 3 different kind of UI front ends. And by defining them and then having a couple of things that are expected to be different in each language, mapping our way through all of that, we can create these commands that are kind of resilient, right? If you want to say, what's it doing? Okay, it's going to assert that this is here. It's going to use this helper to say, I'm going to type this into the to-do app. And I'll show you this back in Cypress Cloud as well, of like what this test is doing as it goes through everything. But this is a good way to make something that's resilient, especially if you're thinking about something like this and you do not yet have functional tests, or you want to vacuum in a lot of content that is not already covered by functional tests. So one approach is using prompt. That is a pretty quick way to get started, and it may be really robust for you long term, and you wouldn't have to do a lot of other work. There are situations where a prompt is not going to be your first choice. You can also eject this and take the code. I don't have a strong opinion on like whether you should use this particular solution, as much as it definitely does work for a lot of needs where you want to be vague enough to be resilient and specific enough to make sure your tests are still happening. There's a totally separate approach in a different file over here as well. And this one I've called a crawler. This is taking a website that we built as a documentation site for this to-do app. It's 100 pages of documentation, and that's kind of silly, but the whole point is you want to vacuum all that into an accessibility report. So I have an example here where we just request a sitemap. We use that. We go through it all. The test is really fast. I won't show it because it flickers horribly, and it would cause like a seizure triggering situation. So I'm not going to play through this test, but just going to each URL, rendering it, doing something consistent like going to the bottom, maybe changing the viewport. These things are all a good way to make an accessibility test that does not influence, get broken easily, because all it's doing is loading the pages. So you mix some of that for your broad areas with some of the standard Cypress functional testing for the areas that have lots of interactions, and you can get like very good coverage out of that. So I'm going to switch over to the tab that has this information in it, and we'll share that. And some of this anticipates a question that's coming as well around how we deal with these like multi-team, multi-language situations. So first of all, we're going to come back over here. And here's that one spec that does the crawling. So the crawler in here is going to produce this effect where we can look at the test replay. The docs have bad color contrast on mobile. So even that repeatable test, if we were to scroll through and like look at some of the steps of this, we can see that we're getting into the mobile viewport, and that's where a lot of the issues are. And that's something that is captured then in Cypress accessibility. If we take a look at what's in here for this, we see the elements that are missing color contrast. And so even though that is not present as an issue on the default viewport, I specifically set this up to be broken on mobile only. Just doing that one type of variation, maybe changing light mode, dark mode, that can expose things into Cypress accessibility. But then for the situations where we have a lot of individual things to cover with regard to variations, the more combinatorial approach, this is what that test looks like that was doing all the different languages. So when you take that spec file and you just run all the combinations of 3 languages and 2 themes for a to-do app, you get a bunch of different tests. You get 78 in total that ran. And we can look at the replay in cloud as well to see like what those were like. So this is just a basic one at the beginning of this default set of things. That's like English language default theme. And as we go down through these iterations, we can see, okay, we have the monochrome theme, what's going on in here. These tests are doing different functional things with that as well. So as we open up that, a little bit of a different theme, more stuff happening, and we can see the underlying prompt commands that were generated in the Cypress code that runs. And then all of those variations feed into the accessibility report. And lastly, we'll look at synthwave and French. So this kind of cross-team situation happens a lot once you get into content management systems and different brands and stuff like that. This represents the idea that you have a brand. Maybe you've got a website for a core set of things that are used by a whole bunch of different hotel businesses or a whole bunch of different, garages or whatever. Those are all things that have a core set of functionality, and then they exist in different ways in production based on the owner of the brand. And then there's interlocking teams within the work as well, where maybe this area of functionality is there. this to-do list app has, of course, these toggles that might be one team, and then you got to have a sign-up form for a newsletter in your to-do list app. So that's going to be like another team's work. So we'll get to that piece in a second. But yeah, this is some of the ideas around making resilient tests, and then that feeds into your accessibility report because you can consume a lot of application states very quickly without a ton of test code and get a bunch of feedback out of Cypress accessibility.
Thanks, Mark. I think that we had some questions come in that I think apply directly to what you're talking about right now. You showed your example utilizing SciPrompt. So can you talk a little bit about how SciPrompt supports accessibility checks, since we're already here in the middle of the topic?
Yeah, we can talk about it. So there is a range of people who might use something like Cypress Accessibility, going from everybody who has an existing massive Cypress suite and they just want to add on the accessibility tests, to people who want like a good accessibility artifact and they don't know a lot about Cypress yet. So SciPrompt is a way to just write this plain English sentence that says, okay, the test step should be this and should be this and should be this. If you're just driving the interface and you're not doing like intercepting the network and everything, you can do a lot of things directly in SciPrompt. But you can also mix and match it with like some setup to say, hey, I need to do this bunch of tests that walk through my particular application after the login. So I need to have some direct code to like set up my session and see the database, and that can all be normal Cypress code. And then you can write the steps of the test in Cypress prompt. And the reason it helps with a resilient approach to accessibility testing is those steps will not be saved as specific Cypress code unless you choose it. So if you then take that same set of tests and you run it against a migrated build of the application that moved from Angular to Vue or something, you might break all of your selectors. You might not have access to make test IDs or make stable selectors. But because prompt is present in your test, what it will do is look at its previously saved code that it cached on its own in Cypress. And then it will say, oh, I can't find my Angular ng whatever element anymore. Can I still find what we called the login button? Is that UI still present? And so we can heal the steps of the tests in a way that lets the test continue to function and doesn't require maintenance of selectors and things like that. So it's particularly good if you are looking to turn like acceptance criteria into tests, because you may already have them in this nice sequence of like actions and subject matter in the DOM. And it's particularly good if you are less familiar with Cypress and you just want to see what's going on. And then the philosophy around, do you want long-term self-healing and what is your tolerance for that? That is definitely company to company, person to person. There's a different taste and acceptance of self-healing as like valuable in testing or as somewhat risky. And it prompt does it well, but it's also there's a taste aspect there.
Yeah, thanks for jumping over to that. I think we've talked a good bit about, like standard functionality and like how the accessibilities checks actually execute. And we've mentioned that, this can span multiple teams. But let's really dive into that head on now. I have a question here that I'd like us to answer, which is how Cypress handles multi-team accessibility workflows. So, Mark, I know you're going to have a lot of great insight into this. So I'd love for you to dive in and tell us like when Cypress accessibility is utilized and there's an organization where these responsibilities fall across multiple teams. What does that look like in practice? And are there ways to achieve optimization so you don't stop velocity, but you're also not stepping on each other as you go along?
Yeah, we can talk through those things. It looks like, just side note, Jenna, that I've lost the ability to share my screen again. I don't need to right away, but just in case there's a permission you can change there. So the things I think are trickiest with the multi-team workflows is not stepping on each other. And the main solution for that in Cypress is to consider who is the owner of a given run. So if I'm a developer and I make a pull request and I belong to the checkout team at the organization, I'm changing code related to the checkout flow, most likely. We have a good restriction in terms of what I expect to be responsible for. But there are these overlapping concerns then between the possible sources of introducing accessibility issues. And the more complex your team setup is, the more we need to work on the configuration to have specific criteria applied to each run. So again, a good example, if I'm on a checkout team, when the Cypress accessibility report runs, it can pick up through a tag on your run that you're part of a specific team. This came out towards the end of last year. A lot of these workflows came out towards working with larger organizations with more complex things. So you may want to filter your results based on the ownership of the team for the pull request context. And that might leave a little gap where things are going to slip through because the developer broke something outside of their scope. So not great. You'd want to keep an eye on that and have separate regression runs that are going to test everything across all teams. So if those are happening, you have some feedback there. But the reason to be careful on the PRs especially is developers have an enormous fatigue from like noisy tools. I feel this with visual regression all the time, where 90% of the information I see there is going to be based on things that change but were trivial. So with accessibility, in order to not have people be really irritated and feel like it's noisy, it's useful to scope it way down on what they're responsible for. That's going to be the feedback they get if you're considering blocking a build. And then even within that, you can decide to block using our results API, which we may not go into detail here, but we've got the docs for it. You can decide to do that kind of thing, and you'll still be able to refine which rules you care about in order to block. So you can do really fine-grained feedback to the tolerance level and the experience of that individual team there. But then you also need something that you can send over to a designer and you can send over to a content person where maybe the responsibility is not in the pull requests. And I think this is something else that produces noise and people get fatigued over, where a missing alt attribute might be that the code is bad, or it might be that you have a content management system wherein an editor is supposed to put that attribute and you're not going to be able to fix it from the code. So why block you on a pull request for something that you can't fix? Or it could come from a design system and require a pull request to a totally different place. So it's still not probably something you're going to fix in your branch if it's not your issue that introduced it. But you have an artifact you can take to that person and say, hey, I'm going to send you like the deep link like I was showing you here. So I will share again to show this. So yeah, you can do a deep link here and you'll be able to send that artifact over. And then you can also do scoped runs. Like I'll show you config profiles now on one of these runs. You can do a scoped run where here everything is ignored because of the tag on here, which is the theme team that's defined in the configuration for this run, that we're going to ignore everything that's not there. So this area of the DOM that is within that team's ownership, here it's like very clearly identified, and some of our customers have exactly this type of setup, right? Data clean, data owner, something like that. So you can have it run on this basis, and this did not affect all the other runs we have where these issues were present and visible, but it said, hey, these color contrast issues that are in that other application that happens to be in the same run, or this element ARIA attribute issue, this is not going to be affecting your team. Your team is only going to see things as failures if they actually pertain to you. This might be the best example of that, where there's a select in here that I think will be like in that application. Cool, it's in here. But if we do some debugging, we can discover like the ownership of this is probably not the people who do the theme, right? We can take a look at where it is in the DOM and verify somewhere up here. There's a tasks team, there's a newsletter team, right? All these people have different little areas of the DOM. So for micro front ends, for mono repos, for those types of setup, this is good. And then for a designer or something, if we have these color contrast issues, you could say on developers, on those PRs, we're just not going to block on color contrast because it's unlikely a developer is deciding that. They should be using approved colors. So if we're not blocking developers, we can still find these ignored things, groom them separately. In this case, you can make a JIRA issue, do the handoff of that issue over there, and it'll come with the links back in here. So your judgment about what needs to be signal and what needs to be noise and how you implement that in Cypress is really up to you, but then affords a ton of customization to avoid people being bothered by things they're not able to fix.
Thanks for diving into that, Mark. I think another topic that maybe falls in line here is, the way the team treats the QA process around accessibility. So, is it happening in the early stages? Is it more of a reactionary piece? So, let's go ahead and I'll share this question on the screen. How do you evolve a team from the detect and report to prevent regressions by default without causing CI fatigue or resistance from developers?
I will show the slides for this, but the core idea is kind of like a linter. We don't want to turn everything on all at once and say, okay, you're now accountable for 100 accessibility rules that you never heard of. It's often really good to roll it out in a way that lets developers experience success at fixing things and what that's supposed to look like. So what I had brought up here is this set of information in the slides in here related to like what you do with your Cypress accessibility results. So you always have an existing standard. If you try something like this, you're going to be passing something, right? You might even have like a 90% score where most of the rules are passing, but you still have like 500 bad buttons and form fields. So it's a serious report. But when you look at this and you want to adopt it with developers, you can see there's a set of current issues in there. There's a set of what is your implicit standard now. You might be trying to reach WCAG 2.2 to meet your legal obligations, but you already have some things you're working on that are passing. So this is going to be the area where you need to defend as much as possible. Very likely, if something's going from green to red, and it's on a developer's branch and in scope of your configuration, they introduced it and they can be responsible for resolving it, asking the questions and getting it back to green on their branch before they merge. And then there's this low-hanging fruit where we need to look at what are the issues that are important and relatively easy to fix. They don't require a big discussion and have a small element count where you can get those into the green bucket as quick as you can. That will help developers discover like the feeling of winning and having these things get gradually accumulated, and then adjusting the configuration so that there's not noise in here is great. Ideally for me, everything that you would do in Cypress accessibility would be fair game for someone who's going to click around, that they would be able to always pick up a ticket based on, oh, I see an issue that's red in Cypress. I care about that issue. Our team cares about that issue. I should work on that issue. And anything that's not that, ignore in the things developers are looking at so they don't go down rabbit holes on things they can't work on.
I think that's good insight. And I think that, you know, thinking about responsibility is an ownership of the violations that are identified in your accessibility checks is something that is likely top of mind for people working in this situation where there are many teams involved in bringing accessibility initiatives or continually monitoring them. So we have another question here that kind of follows this line of thought of, have you seen effective patterns for mapping accessibility failures to team ownership automatically? And how reliable are they in practice?
So the pattern that I've seen work really well is the one that I described with the DOM containing the ownership information. By page is fine in Cypress accessibility because we break things out by page anyway, and you can definitely do things like configure certain URLs to be grouped together. Like if you've got 500 pieces of blog content that are all the same template underneath, right? They don't need to be assessed as 500 individual pages. So using the route information is perfectly fine, and that will help you consolidate things by team. But you can also look at specifically if there's cross-cutting ownership around the pages. That's where it's more complicated, where the header and footer are like, maybe not owned by anybody. They might be owned by marketing or something, and then the actual structural pieces and the components are owned by individual teams. So the config profiles approach where you can map to the owner is really good. And then there was also in Cypress the ability to reprocess old runs. So if you decide later that a run had too big of a scope and you're like, I did this last week with a customer, they introduced a new navigation. And so the navigation was coming from the design system, and it was supposed to be better for accessibility to use the design system component. But it's hard to prove that when there's a lot of other accessibility issues like into the mix. So one of the things you can do to establish the ownership after the fact is you could just go back. I went back to December where the old nav was the only one in there. and I ignored everything but the old nav and reprocessed that old run. And then I went forward into now where the new navigation is there, and the same thing, pull out all the noise. And you could see they had like 10 rules failing in the old run, nice and isolated. And they had 2 or 3 rules failing where I was like, oh, you do have some new accessibility issues here. You've got nested interactive controls and some stuff. And their team was like, oh, yeah, we know that. It's in the design system. It's already fixed. We got to pull it through. So being able to explore and reprocess and like not be locked into what you decided at the moment of executing the run gives you a really good mix of like finding what a team owns, but finding it later.
Now, when we're talking about, bringing accessibility checks earlier in the process, right? And, doing that in a way that creates the least resistance possible to your daily workflows. We all know how prominent agentic workflows are in our day to day now. So, how can you integrate the results of accessibility checks into those AI workflows?
So there is some new stuff here that we can talk about today. This was one of the most popular types of questions, right? This is no single question, but it was the most common of all the questions was something about how is this related to AI. And so as we've worked over the last couple of years with the customers on this, the needs have changed for how the data will be processed. And one of the things that we've done is recently enough launched the beta of the MCP for Cypress Cloud, and that will now have accessibility information in there as well. So I'll show you a little preview of what that is like, so we can kind of talk through the impact of that. I'll go with the slides first because I feel like live things when you're screen sharing and also having the communication with some other service. Let's just screen share the slides first of all. So this is the task that I gave the agent, right? I said, hey, here's check the newest accessibility results from Cypress Cloud. This is all in cursor. I'm just saying I've worked on some stuff. I know there's a recording up there. I want you to go and get it. And so it's able to use this tool to find the details of the accessibility failures that I had made. And those come from a particular run, which I can show you in a minute, but it's pulling down these and reporting like, here's what I found, here's what we're going to do. And then because the instruction was create an action plan for resolving them, it produced this set of things, right? Here's the root cause, here's some drill down into the components, here's how this site is structured. So don't just fix 100 HTML static files that you see, but like use the generator for the docs page. And then this was the outcome of having it do that, reviewing the plan and asking it to execute the plan, was to resolve all of these issues that were present on the doc site that I'd intentionally put there for demo purposes. And so to have a run then that was a clean Axe core run with 100% score was really useful. You can see the difference here in the branch review area as well. And while we don't track the passing elements, you can expand these to see like what pages those elements are on and stuff like that. Because we're more concerned with, do you have failures and can you expose those? So that's the core of how you will be able to wrangle some of these pieces of information. There's multiple tools in there. Emily is here, who's the product manager on the MCP project. So there is some support as well if you want to follow up on learning more about that itself. But this would be the primary way to get the results into your kind of agentic world, if that's something you want to do, and be able to programmatically do it. To me, the key thing for this, for my usage, is still a little bit new. It's still not, I think, available publicly in the MCP. So what you just saw was a preview, but I like the idea of using it to help form a plan and reviewing the plan in order to understand like what's changing and figure out for myself, like what are the sources of issues that are introduced. So if there was more complexity, like with multiple teams, we might not want to try to fix something that's occurring because of the material UI library and is not in our code base, or that requires a content fix or a different team to be brought in. So we've seen different patterns where people do want to use this automatically to resolve the issues, especially if they're using AI for the programming part anyway. At least give it the feedback immediately on what issues were detected, let it take a pass, and then review the PR after those initial things have been done. I think there's lots of potential patterns to get the most out of this. And then definitely some people are also asking for it in order to do triage and just create Jira issues and like have a more the downstream workflow that's not just fix the issues.
Yeah, that's exciting. I think it'll be great to see that make its way into the newly available Cloud MCP and get it in folks' hands to be able to move that process forward. I know right now we've kind of been pretty narrowly focused in the weeds of like tactical execution of accessibility checks, but I'd like to zoom out just a little bit and focus on how you can go from something like a WCAG test results in like some sheet with criteria and doing manual fixes and testing of those manual fixes into a automation cycle. Like what can you give us an overview of what that looks like so that you can help those folks that are still working their way into the automated processes?
Yeah, absolutely. When I read that question, it occurred to me that this is not an either or situation. There is a level of human judgment and expertise, and that like person to person communication aspect of accessibility that is not going to be automated away. So the transition from like manual testing to automation is not okay. We're going to stop doing this completely and start doing only this. And I think those efforts are a little bit naive, even though sometimes it's where people start. So you want to get the most that you can from the automation. And there's two ways to think about it. Mainly, if it's showing up as an error in your automation, it's like definitely an issue. The automation is not proving that everything is passing and compliant, but is if there's a button without a name, you don't need a screen reader to tell you that that button doesn't have a name. There's not going to be a secret way that a name has been added to your button that is going to show up in a screen reader. You know for sure a button with no text in it showing up in Xcore almost certainly is an actual issue that you need to fix. And so for everything you can automate in this way and review through the automation, you have a, a way to get ahead of those things. And you could just stop it there with the Band-Aid. But I also think there's a really good practice wherein your team has the accessibility knowledge to just tweak the behavior a little bit and say when we've detected something with automation, that's a hotspot in the application. We need to also look around and see what else might be going on with that component, where if we didn't wire up the labels correctly, are there things that are more human judgment, more editorial focused, where you should look there now because your attention is on that area? You're going to make a pull request to fix that small issue, or you're going to work on it in the PR you have now. You can probably find something manually that would be really impactful around that area too. And it doesn't take very long to check, again, because you're already there. I think that's super powerful, a little bit underutilized aspect of automation to just call attention to potential hotspots in the application, and really, it really helps you get a little bit more. I think about sometimes the chess advice. I know Ronald is here and helps the big chess fan of like find a good move and then find a better one, right? That second layer of like thinking about how you're going to solve it and what it means for that person who's going to be using it on the other end. That can get ahead of all kinds of potential issues.
Thanks, Mark. I think we'll have time for going through one more of our pre-submitted questions here, and then I want to move us over into those that are in the Q&A panel. So this one is more about your experience with designing applications that you know are going to be tested for accessibility. When you're making design decisions for those applications, is there a single design decision that has long-term impacts on accessibility testing, whether it be positive or whether it be negative? And why is that the single design decision that determines those impacts?
So I had interpreted this question a little differently when I read it around like the test design of your setup. And I'll answer it that way because for some reasons I don't want to deviate too much from what I had thought about already because we're at the end. So on the test design, yeah, and the single design decision around accessibility testing, The mingling of unrelated runs, to me, like from Cypress accessibility perspective, is one of the things that has the most impact. Where if you have a lot of runs on your Cypress Cloud projects it's a single project, but you have 20 different tags running regression runs and subsets of runs for different teams and everything, that can often create clutter that you then have to unpack when you're analyzing the accessibility results, because they're not going to be apples to apples. They're not always going to do the same things. So optimizing that project structure in your testing organization is very good for quality of life across everything. Like I showed you config profiles, that's definitely one option where the team must work in the same Cypress project. And we have customers where that's the case. They already have 100 projects. They can't have 10 projects for all of their teams because that would be 1,000 projects. It's too much. So thinking about project structure and producing consistent runs. Cypress Cloud projects are very flexible. You can make it so that they are just basically a bucket into which to put runs that are similar enough that you want to analyze them together. And then tracking your results, tracking your cross-project metrics. I'll show you enterprise reporting where some of this comes into play, where we might be able to see like the things that are new that depend upon this type of structure, and it can be a huge advantage in presenting the information to have this there. So we're going to pop this open. This will be brief. It's nice to show this because there is something brand new in here too. If you're a current customer and you haven't seen this part of Cypress accessibility, just added some of this type of tracking across the individual rule sets and the severity levels over time. This has been much in demand and had a few things with it, but I'd quite like to be able to see something like this, for example, where we can look across these two projects that this individual rule is starting to fail in a way that bubbled up into the weekly average. And these are just two of our demo projects anyway that have a wide range of things in there. But being able to go high level like this and have the project boundaries to compare against each other and merge together and like filter by branches and stuff like that, that impacts your ability to communicate about the results and what kind of alerting you have and what kind of Slack integrations you have. So can't say enough about the benefits of like the most boring topic in the world, good cloud project organization. Can really change the quality of life of like using these things.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to send us over to a question that came in from the audience, and I'll share that up here on the screen. Sebastian asked, related to the coordination between teams and devs, what would you say would be the best way to get that kind of collaboration between quality teams and the developers? Is it, devs checking Cypress Cloud? Is it them doing that directly for only debugging and fixing? Should they be getting results in a more process fashion from their quality counterparts? Creating JIRA tickets, all these are possible, but what do you think is the most effective to really achieve that accessibility collaboration?
So from the quality perspective, if you work on the QA side of the house, it's nice to be able to like accurately make something someone else's problem really smoothly, right? You're not necessarily going to fix it, but you want to get it on their backlog in a way they can correctly size and act on. The JIRA tickets are really good for that because they send a direct link, and the direct link has test replay for reproduction steps, and you're not having to make a big bug report. The missing piece in that might be the results API as well, wherein the developer, if you're looking at it post-merge, you can still have a programmatic response to what's coming from Cypress accessibility. So if I bring this up here, I'll show you what I mean by that. So because it doesn't block anything in your tests don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know anything about accessibility results while Cypress is executing, you need to use this other method of like getting the results in here. So similar for UI coverage, but for accessibility, we'll look at that here. We have a helper package that will let you get yielded the results. So you use our package, we will pull the results from the current run. Similar to the MCP in the way of like it's already there in the cloud, the run's completed, you want to get this out. This is a little bit more high level and it's not plugged into that MCP off flow. But this is just how you would pull everything to be able to say, I'm going to put up a flag because we've broken a policy, like I have one new failing issue or something like that. The way that people do this is as an extra check in here. For example, in GitHub, everything is passing, visual regression is passing. I'm using that API to say we need to block because we have a critical rule failure that used to be green. You can do this at the page level. You can do this at the overall level. You can have multiple different approaches to it for different pages. And then there's also baselines that people do where you might take an existing run that has this set of things that are happening on each page. And you might say, I'm going to point to that as the baseline. And in the most sophisticated implementation of this I've seen, the person who does that work is also building the branch review URL. So if you are blocking the developer, you're saying, hey, you're blocked on merging this build, or you have to go and debug this because it was on your run after you merged your code. So I'm going to send you a link that has the base run and the change run and the branch all set correctly so you can see what it is that you did and that you're responsible for fixing. And if we just flip these two, you'll actually see what that looks like. So this artifact of the correct branch comparison, wherein you do think there's been something introduced by a teammate, this then lets them go, all right, even if I have 500 things in this report, these 6 elements are the ones that are my introduced failures. So I have to go and figure out why this was passing here and why it's failing on my builds that I'm responsible for. And then all the noise is gone. So that's a process I'd love to be more automatic. As you could probably tell, there's a few different steps in getting all the data there. But it can be done, and it's definitely useful to do it in its current form, even though there's pieces of this, from my perspective, we would like to do more built in.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. So, folks, thank you for joining us today. That is all we have time for. We are actually already at time, so we are going to thank Mark for all of his insights and for walking us through these workflows and sharing how you can approach accessibility testing when you have multiple teams who have a stakeholder in ownership. Before we sign off, just a few quick things. In terms of wrapping up our session today, you are going to see a survey on your screen. And that survey will take just a minute to fill out and give us a lot of great feedback for future sessions on how it could even be better next time. You will be receiving a follow-up email after this session. Do make sure to check it. You will be getting the announcement of winners for folks who got those free accessibility reports in that message. And speaking of future webinars, we have another one coming up with our very own Mark Noonan. And that one is quality, speed, and all those agents staying on the rails with UI coverage, coming up on April 23rd at 1 p.m. Eastern. So if you're thinking about how to balance application health while scaling velocity through agentic workflows, that is a session you're definitely going to want to catch. You can also catch us every other week on the Bug Bash live stream. The next one's coming up on Tuesday at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be showcasing community-built plugins that help solve real-world testing complexity. And finally, if you want to put any of the workflows that you've seen today to work in your team, then you can start a free trial of Cypress Accessibility using that button on the top right of your screen. All you need is an email. Thanks again for spending time with us today, and until next time, folks, happy testing.